Do you ever think about your legacy? About how you'll be remembered after you're gone? The influence that you've had on those around you? What it is that you'll leave behind? Let's leave all modesty aside. I don't think it makes you vain if, in your heart of hearts, you hope to have a lasting legacy. It'd be a sign of how impactful your life was. I forget who, but I once heard someone say that they want to build a church that was so valuable to its neighborhood that the whole city would cry if it ever burnt down. I want a life like that, don't you? To live in such a way that you leave behind a legacy of blessing and a big hole in everyone's hearts. That is a good life. I'm going to propose this morning that legacy is a lot more important to us than we appreciate. We don't give it a lot of conscious thought, but I believe it shapes how we behave and how we view ourselves. We want to know that the work we do has meaning, that it's making a difference. We want to be a positive presence and leave the world just a little bit better than when we first arrived. The importance of legacy becomes even more apparent when we struggle with it. We're all busy people, kept tired from running the treadmill of late-stage capitalism. Very few of us get to live the sort of lives that we would want. If you're not able to find work that gives you purpose, or relationships that create a sense of meaning, it can be profoundly demoralizing. We want the actions we do now to have meaningful impact beyond us. Now, it's hard to find meaning in trading stocks or predatory lending, so those with the money to do so will sometimes outsource their legacy. They'll donate to causes that matter to them, maybe get a plaque on a chair, or if you have enough, they'll get a whole hospital wing or university named after them. Now, as someone working in charity who hopes to be the beneficiary of such legacy building, I'm not going to criticize it. If you can't build a legacy on your own, store-bought is fine. I'm just highlighting that legacy matters more than we often appreciate. And it mattered to King David. In today's reading, David wants to build God a house. Up until this point in their history, the symbol of God's presence with Israel was a tent or a tabernacle. David's dissatisfied with this. God deserves something bigger. Now that the people are done wandering, now that they've built themselves homes and palaces in the Promised Land, surely God deserves to have something permanent too. At first glance, this seems like a pretty good argument. The prophet Nathan fully agreed with David. But there was something behind David's motivations that made God say, hold on. Last week, I told you about an unconventional interpretation of David's wife, Michal. One scholar suggests that when she criticized David for dancing in the street, it was actually the voice of God chastising David's dictatorial ambitions. God likes David, but God never liked kings. By parading in front of the ark, wearing a garment meant only for the high priest, David is conflating the power of the temple with the palace. He's setting himself up as this sort of God king, slipping into the same problems that his predecessor Saul had. Now I'm starting to side a bit more with this interpretation as I consider the next chapter in 2 Samuel. Here again, God rebukes or corrects David, saying while a temple would be nice, God didn't ask for it or need it. The drive to build this is coming only from David. Why? I see two reasons. First is political. David is centralizing religious authority in his capital, Jerusalem. It's about consolidating more power under the veneer of being pious. But the second reason is more personal. I think David wanted a legacy. As king, David seems to have all the power in the world. He has everything you'd want, except he doesn't have control over what people will say about him when he's gone. Now, he has just usurped power from King Saul, and he's witnessed how a king can go from being beloved to being despised, and David was one contributing factor in Saul's demise. David knows that he is equally as vulnerable. People love him now, but what about after he's gone? What will they remember then? His solution is to build something that is so big, so impressive, so generous in its beauty that no one could deny how generous and great David was. Whoever builds this temple is going to be remembered in a positive way for as long as that temple remains. David's desire to build a house for the Lord is really about David building his own legacy. So much of church building is legacy building. When we plant churches, we do it, yes, to share the gospel and make disciples, but on a more personal, individual level, it's really also about building something that will be remembered for years to come. I like reading local histories, and one of my new favorites is this history of the Presbyterian Synod of Alberta. It was written in 1968 to mark the nation's centennial, and it is written with such optimism in it. The period of our denomination in the 60s was one of rapid growth, corresponding with the baby boom. In fact, they titled this anthology Growth. What I find in this book, as well as the other histories I've read about the first churches in Alberta, is this sense of legacy. Those building the churches were confident that what they built would last for hundreds of years. They wanted to be part of that history, to be founding charter members of these new churches. They wrote down their histories with an expectation that future generations would be reading this. I'm sure they expected that the Synod would probably publish additional anthologies at, say, the 150th anniversary of Canada. We didn't, though. In fact, we didn't even remember that this book existed. Reverend Annabel Wallace found a copy of it in Westmount's archives, and when she brought it up at a presbytery gathering, it was a little bit of a shock. It had been lost to our collective memories. In the same way, a number of the churches mentioned here have been lost too. They didn't have the legacy that people were hoping for. When building a church, we say we're focused on building up the gospel, but more often than not, we're more focused on building our own legacy. I know this because I was guilty of it. When I started in ministry, I was appointed to a new church development in Parkland County. They called themselves Parkland First. It was an odd name for a new church, sounded a bit like a bank. They named it that because they had these ambitions to build even more churches in the county. This would be the first, but there would be a Parkland Second and a Parkland Third. And on its own, that's as good a reason to name a church as any other. However, there were a lot of egos attached to that name, which became apparent when someone tried to change it. There's a donation of land offered to the congregation if only they were willing to change their name after the person who donated the land. That person wanted to build a legacy as much as everyone else in the church wanted to build a legacy. So there was this clash of egos, and in the end, the donation never happened. Now, I'm not pointing fingers at anyone. I was equally guilty about wanting to build my own legacy. I was drawn to church planting because I wanted to be the first minister of a church that would last for generations. I think we all used the church as a way of securing our own legacies. We did care about building God's kingdom too, but there was this underlying motivation of building our own legacy that I, at least, didn't recognize at the time. I wonder how much of that desire for a legacy influences other congregations. We know it happened a lot in the past. Just look at all the plaques that we tend to have dedicated to the glory of God and the loving memory of. We don't do that quite as much as we used to, but I wonder if a lot of our attachment to our church buildings is because we want to secure our own legacies. That's a question for your own reflection, and I'll affirm again that it's not a bad thing to want to have a positive legacy. But if we are building a legacy under the guise of building God's kingdom, we're going to run into conflicts. God will correct us, just as God corrected David. When David offers to build a temple, God says, "No, thank you." A temple will be built in due time, but not by David, because David's intentions aren't quite right. Instead, God very compassionately acknowledges the real anxiety that David is feeling. David wants to build a house for God that will be his legacy, but instead God says, "I will build you a house. I am in charge of your legacy. And from your offspring I will raise a person who will establish my kingdom forever." As Christians, we see that as the prophecy of Jesus Christ, who descends from the line of David. On a more personal, individual level, I think God is simply assuring David that he doesn't have to worry about his legacy. God is in control of it. God will use the good works that David is doing now to build God's kingdom. If David's poems, if his songs, if his strategies and policies are to survive, it will be because of God's doing. How David is remembered after he is gone from this earth will be in God's purview. God's got it all under control. Relax. I think that's the same message for us today. We are concerned about building a legacy that will be lasting, making sure that the church building gets passed on to future generations. But those things in the future, all of that is in God's hands. It's more important to be reassured that your legacy, the influence and impact you have in the world, the ways you will be remembered, all of that is in God's loving hands. God uses all of the things you offer, the gifts you bring, to the glory of God. It is in helping others, far more than we realize. The good you are doing now is impacting someone you might not even know. Because of your smile and your kind presence, the world has been improved in ways you can't measure. Your legacy is huge already. You'll never see it, not in this life, of course. And maybe no one else might see it either, but God is all-seeing. God recognizes every little thing you do to be sharing God's love, to embody the good news, to be Christ to your neighbor. And God is faithful with every good opportunity presented, using it to bless others exponentially. Your little offering of bread, blessed by Christ, becomes baskets of bounty. You can't see it yourself. You won't know. But you need to trust. Trust that God is using your hands and feet to share the gospel, your heart to mend the broken, your faith to inspire others. You have a legacy being built for you that goes far beyond you. And as it is a contributing part of God's kingdom, it's like a living stone in the wall of God's temple, and that will last forever. Your legacy is assured. When Christ is its foundation, it lasts forever. Amen.